In the mid-19th century, English factory owners made well, a terrifying yet incredibly lucrative discovery.
Oh, absolutely.
They realized that if they wanted to keep their workers locked into these grueling 16-hour days for just absolute poverty wages, they didn't actually need to hire heavily armed guards.
Right.
They didn't need to build higher walls around the factories. They just needed to convince those English workers that the starving, desperate immigrants living in the damp cellars next door were their greatest enemy. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah, it is arguably one of the most successful and honestly devastating sleights of hand in modern economic history.
It really is. And to understand exactly how that trick was pulled off, we are diving into a massive, heavily analyzed stack of sources today.
Massive is right.
Yeah. We're looking at excerpts from the Marx and Engels collected works, the MECW. And this spans several decades of their correspondence, their journalism, their economic theories, primarily from the 1840s through the 1880s.
It's an immense archive. I mean, we are talking about thousands of pages where Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are just obsessively analyzing global capital.
Right.
But within that mountain of text, there's this very specific recurring obsession, and that is Ireland.
Exactly. So our mission today, for you listening, is to look at how these two thinkers used Ireland as their primary model, like their ultimate historical laboratory, really.
A laboratory is the perfect word for it.
Right. To understand the mechanics of colonial subjugation. So we're going to look at the brutal economics of land tenure and the part that I personally find most unsettling, which is how they argued the ruling classes deliberately manufactured a psychological and economic antagonism between workers just to maintain their own power.
Because Ireland was the test ground. It wasn't just some side project for them, you know.
Right.
It was the clearest window into how systemic exploitation functions when you strip away the polite illusions of the so-called free market.
Now, before we go any further, I do want to establish a very clear baseline for you listening right now. Our goal today is to impartially report and analyze the historical and economic frameworks that Marx and Engels presented in these sources.
Exactly.
We are not here to endorse their political ideologies. This isn't, a manifesto reading. We're looking at their work purely as a highly influential historical lens through which Anglo-Irish relations were viewed. We are examining an intellectual architecture here.
And that distinction is vital. I mean, whether someone aligns with Marxist theory or utterly rejects it, the analytical framework they built to diagnose the situation in 19th century Ireland, it remains a masterclass in dissecting the mechanics of power.
Yeah, it really does.
They were looking at the blueprints of a machine, essentially, trying to figure out how it generated so much wealth for a tiny few and so much misery for millions.
Think of it like looking at the blueprints of a magic trick. We're examining how a ruling class seemingly made class solidarity just disappear by using a very specific sleight of hand, which was weaponized nationalism.
That's a great way to frame it.
So let's look at the foundation of that machine. The sources make a very bold claim right out of the gate, which is that Ireland was England's very first colony.
Yes.
But to understand the conquest, we can't just start with the English arriving. We have to look at what was already there because the indigenous Celtic social structure was so profoundly alien to the English system that the two simply could not coexist.
No, they were mutually exclusive operating systems.
Right.
When we think of property today, and certainly when the English ruling class thought of property back then, we think of a deed. We think of a fence.
A piece of paper with your name on it.
Exactly. A single individual owner who has total dominion over a specific patch of dirt. But the Celtic system, which was a clan-based or gens system, fundamentally rejected that premise.
The sources mention a very specific agricultural model used by the Irish called the Rundale system. And I gotta say, from what I'm reading, this sounds like an administrative nightmare for anyone trying to track individual wealth.
Oh, to a modern capitalist, it looks like complete chaos.
Yeah.
But it was actually highly structured for communal survival.
Okay, break that down for me.
So in the Rundale system, the arable land, so we're talking about the good soil by the river, the fertile valleys used for growing crops that was not permanently chopped up into privately owned family farms.
Right.
Instead, the land belonged to the clan, or the sept. The clan leadership would combine all the good land and then share it out in strips to the peasant households.
But they didn't just hand out a strip and say, okay, this is yours forever.
No.
Yeah.
And that is the crucial difference. The allocation was based on the household's current situation and the quality of the soil. and they would periodically redivide these strips.
Wow.
Yeah, our sources note that even deep into the 19th century, in some isolated Western areas, this redivision was still happening
Annually.
annually. And furthermore, the moorland, the bogs, the rough pastures for grazing livestock, that was entirely common land.
Yeah.
Everyone grazed their animals together.
Okay, hold on. I have to challenge the long-term viability of that. I mean, if I know that my strip of land might be given to my neighbor next year, I have absolutely zero incentive to improve it.
Right, from an individualistic perspective.
Yeah. I'm not going to build a stone wall. I'm not going to invest in heavy fertilization because I won't reap the long-term rewards. Didn't the system just completely prevent the accumulation of capital?
You've just perfectly articulated the exact horror of the English colonial lawyers.
I can imagine.
Yes, it absolutely prevented the accumulation of individual capital. But that was a feature, not a bug, of the Celtic system. The goal wasn't for one person to get incredibly rich while their neighbor starved.
Right.
The goal was the continued survival of the entire clan. It was a social safety net woven into the very dirt itself.
And the inheritance laws reflected that too, didn't they? Because the English operated on primogeniture. You know, the oldest legitimate son inherits the entire estate, which keeps the wealth consolidated.
Yes, right.
But the Irish had a system called gavelkind.
Gavelkind is fascinating. Under this Irish custom, when a male member of the clan died, his land wasn't just handed to his eldest son.
That was what happened?
The tenancies were partitioned among all the male kinsmen of the sept, and the sources specifically highlight that this included both bastards and legitimate sons. The clan made no legal distinction when it came to survival.
Wow. And it gets even more radical than that because the chief could just trigger a total reset.
That's right. After a partition was made, if any significant member of the sept died, the chief had the authority to make a completely new partition of all the lands belonging to the sept.
Just shuffle the deck entirely.
Exactly. Reassigning everyone a new part according to their seniority and their need at that time.
And even the leadership structure wasn't strictly hereditary. They used a system called tanistry.
Yes. They didn't want the risk of a child inheriting leadership just because of who his father was.
Which makes sense for survival.
Totally. Under tanistry, the successor to the chief, called the tanist, was elected from among the eligible males of the ruling family during the current chief's lifetime.
Oh, while he was still alive.
Right. The criteria was simply who is the eldest and worthiest. They needed a capable military and administrative leader, not just a lucky firstborn.
I'm just trying to picture an English lawyer like Sir John Davies in the early 1600s arriving in Ireland armed with a worldview built entirely on strict private property, individual ownership, and absolute landlord authority.
It would be mind-bending for him.
Right. He looks at this Celtic system and his brain must have just short-circuited.
It did. The English jurists looked at this and declared it barbaric. They described the Celtic communal ownership as having no estate, but only a transient and scambling possession.
Scambling possession.
Yeah. Because the English legal mind could not comprehend a society where land wasn't a commodity to be bought, sold, leveraged, and inherited by a single individual, they decided the Irish system wasn't just different, it was invalid.
Invalid, wow.
It was a legal void that needed to be filled by English civilization.
But implementing that quote-unquote civilization took an agonizingly long time. I mean, the sources map out a conquest spanning from the initial Norman invasions around 1100 all the way to the mid-19th century.
Yes.
Over 700 years. If the English military was so vastly superior, why did it take 7 centuries to lock in this property system?
Because you can't just defeat an army to erase a property system. You have to dismantle a way of life that exists at the cellular level of the society.
Right.
And the English faced a recurring, incredibly frustrating problem, which was assimilation.
Assimilation.
Yeah. Every time the English crown sent over a wave of settlers and soldiers to pacify the land and establish English estates, those settlers would eventually integrate.
Oh, that's right. The sources have a great phrase for this. They say the English settlers, within a few generations, fell under the charm of Celtic society and turned more Irish than the Aborigines.
Exactly. They adopted the language, the customs, and crucially, they started adopting the Celtic attitudes toward land and clan loyalty, often marrying into the local septs.
So they just became part of the system they were sent to destroy.
Right, which meant the English crown would have to launch a new conquest, confiscate the lands of the previous English settlers who had gone native, and then send over a fresh batch of colonizers. It was this cyclical, bloody process.
But that cycle finally breaks in the 17th century. And it breaks with a level of bureaucratic ruthlessness that really sets the stage for everything Marx and Engels are analyzing. We have to talk about Oliver Cromwell and the Act of Settlement in 1652.
Cromwell is the inflection point where the conquest shifts from medieval skirmishes to modern, systematic, industrialized displacement.
How so?
Well, following a massive Irish rebellion, the English Parliament under Cromwell passed the Act of Settlement to essentially legalize wholesale plunder. They declared the vast majority of Ireland's indigenous Catholic population guilty of revolt.
But wait, guilty of revolt implies they were actually fighting. Were they only targeting combatants?
Not at all. That was the dark genius, if you want to call it that, of the legislation. If you simply failed to demonstrate constant active loyalty to the English Parliament during the wars, you were deemed guilty.
Constant act of loyalty, so just existing quietly was a crime.
Yes. And the punishment was the total confiscation of your ancestral lands.
The famous phrase associated with this era is to hell or to Connaught, right?
Yes, exactly. The Act of Satisfaction in 1653 formalized this. The indigenous Irish families were forcibly pushed out of the rich, fertile agricultural lands of the east and south, so the provinces of Leinster and Munster.
And driven where?
They were driven westward into the rocky, barren, completely unforgiving landscape of Connaught and County Clare.
So you completely depopulate the prime real estate. Who gets it?
It was handed over to English adventurers, which was the 17th century term for venture capitalists and speculators who had financially backed Cromwell's war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, as well as the officers and soldiers of Cromwell's army. This was a massive wealth transfer.
So they just wiped the map clean for themselves.
The indigenous people were literally replaced on the good land, locking in the economic foundation of absolute English landlordism.
And to make sure the Irish could never buy that land back, the English government implemented the penal laws. From what the sources detail, this looks like a legal strangulation of an entire demographic.
It was. The penal laws, which spanned the late 17th and 18th centuries, were designed to ensure the Catholic majority could never again pose an economic or political threat.
Right.
Because the conquering class was Protestant and the conquered class was Catholic, religion became the explicit legal proxy for property rights.
Okay, so how exactly did that work in practice? I mean, on a day-to-day level for these people?
It was incredibly detailed and oppressive. A Catholic was legally barred from purchasing land. They could not take out a mortgage.
No mortgages.
No. They could not sign a lease for longer than 31 years, meaning they could never build generational wealth on a farm.
So you're just renting forever.
Exactly. And they used a malicious twisting of the old Irish customs against them, too. If a Catholic landowner died, his estate had to be divided equally among all his sons.
Wait, that sounds like gavel kind, which we just established the Irish liked. Why is that malicious now?
Because in a capitalist, landlord-dominated system, dividing a small estate among 5 sons doesn't create a communal clan.
Huh?
It creates 5 tiny, economically unviable plots of land that will inevitably go bankrupt.
Okay. I see.
Unless, the law stated, the eldest son converted to Protestantism.
Oh.
Yeah. If he converted, he inherited the entire estate intact.
So it was a targeted legal mechanism to atomize and destroy any remaining large Catholic estates, reducing the native population to just absolute poverty.
It was highly effective. It reduced the indigenous population to the status of precarious tenant farmers on the very lands their ancestors had communally owned.
It's just devastating.
The clan system was shattered. The legal framework of landlordism was permanently locked in.
Yeah. Okay, so the table is set. The English legal and property system is now running the Irish operating system. And this leads us to the mid-19th century, which Marx described with a phrase that genuinely gave me chills.
Let me guess. A quiet, business-like extinction.
Yes. A quiet, business-like extinction.
Yeah, this is the era where military conquest is no longer necessary because the raw mechanics of capitalist economics can do the violently displaced work far more efficiently.
Right. So the sources point to a massive macroeconomic shift in the 1840s, specifically hinging on something called the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. I really need you to explain the mechanics of this because it seems to be the catalyst for the entire disaster.
It absolutely is.
What were the Corn Laws and why did erasing them change the physical landscape of Ireland?
Okay, so the Corn Laws were essentially protectionist tariffs. They were trade restrictions placed on imported food and grain in Great Britain designed to keep domestic grain prices artificially high.
High prices.
Which vastly benefited the domestic agricultural producers, namely the wealthy landowners.
So if I'm an English landlord with massive estates in Ireland, I love the Corn Laws. I'm forcing my Irish tenants to grow grain tillage farming, and I'm selling it in England at a massive premium.
Exactly. Ireland functioned as the breadbasket for England. But in 1846, facing intense political pressure from the rising industrial capitalist class in England.
Right, the factory owners.
Yeah, those guys wanted cheaper food so they could pay their factory workers less. So the British government repealed the Corn Laws.
Which means the British market is instantly flooded with cheap foreign grain from places like North America and Russia.
Yes, the price of grain plummets.
It plummets, and
No.
suddenly, tillage farming in Ireland is no longer highly profitable for the landlords.
Exactly.
But England is undergoing the Industrial Revolution. The cities are exploding with people. They still need to eat, and they need raw materials for the factories.
Right. The demand for meat to feed the urban middle classes and wool to feed the textile mills was skyrocketing. So the English landlords in Ireland looked at their ledgers and they did the math.
The cold, hard math.
Right. Tillage farming, growing oats and wheat, requires a massive labor force. You need thousands of peasant families living on the land to plant and harvest it. But pasture farming, grazing cattle and sheep, requires vast tracts of empty land and maybe one or two herdsmen.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the sheer callousness of this. The landlords realized that, pound for pound, a cow was now significantly more profitable than a human tenant.
That is the precise economic calculus. The tenant farmers who had lived on that land for generations paying rent through their labor were suddenly mathematically obsolete.
Mathematically obsolete, that is grim.
They were no longer a source of profit. They were merely taking up valuable grazing space.
So the landlords initiated what the sources refer to as the clearing of the estates. But, you can't just ask tens of thousands of people to politely vacate the land they've lived on for centuries, especially when they have literally nowhere else to go.
No, they didn't ask. They used state-sanctioned brute force.
Yeah.
This is the era of the Crowbar brigades.
The Crowbar brigades. Detail that for me, because it sounds like a paramilitary operation.
Yeah, it essentially was. The land agents, who were hired by absentee landlords living in London, would assemble these teams of toughs, armed with crowbars and picks.
Okay.
These brigades were escorted and protected by the official Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force, and often regiments of the British military.
Wow, so the military's backing them up.
Yes. They would march into a rural village, physically drag the families out of their cottages, and use the crowbars to smash in the roofs and tear down the walls.
Why specifically target the roof, though? Why not just, change the locks?
Well, a mud-walled, thatched roof cabin in Ireland doesn't really have locks in the modern sense. By completely destroying the roof, they ensured the structure was utterly uninhabitable against the harsh Irish rain and cold.
So they couldn't just sneak back in.
Exactly. They were guaranteeing that the family could not sneak back in at night to survive. They forced men, women, the elderly, and infants out into the elements with absolutely nothing.
That's horrifying.
There's a devastating quote Marx includes in Capital from a Galway newspaper in 1852 describing a massive eviction where the brigade tore down an entire village in a single day.
What's the quote?
The quote is, "The sun that rose on a village sets on a desert."
The sun that rose on a village sets on a desert. You have a thriving, living community at dawn, and by dusk, it's just smoking rubble and empty fields ready for imported sheep.
Yeah.
And the systemic clearing was actively supercharged by one of the most traumatic events in European history, which is the Great Famine.
The potato blight, which struck between 1845 and 1847. Now, it's vital to understand how Marx and Engels framed this.
Right.
Most history books treat the famine as a tragic natural disaster, but the sources we are looking at treat it as a political and economic weapon.
Okay, but the blight itself, the fungus that destroyed the potato crop, was biological. You can't blame the landlords for the fungus.
True, the fungus was natural, but the mass starvation, the famine itself was entirely man-made. Ireland was actually producing more than enough grain and livestock to feed its entire population during those years.
Oh, really?
Yes. But that food was cash crops, owned by the landlords, and it was exported to England under armed military guard, while the Irish peasants, who relied exclusively on the potato for their own sustenance, starved to death.
That is just, I mean, it's hard to wrap my head around that level of cruelty. And the sources point out how the English government actually used legislation to turn this starvation into a tool for the landlords to accelerate the evictions, right?
Yes.
They mention the extension of the English Poor Laws to Ireland in 1847. How did a law meant to help the poor actually weaponize the famine?
This is where the bureaucratic evil reaches its absolute peak. The Poor Laws established a system of workhouses for the destitute. But crucially, the law dictated that the local unions, meaning the local property owners and landlords within a specific district were financially responsible for paying a poor rate, a tax, to support the paupers in their specific workhouse.
Okay, let me play this out. Let's say I'm a landlord. My tenant's potato crop just failed. They are starving and cannot pay me rent. Under this new poor law, I am now legally required to pay a tax to feed those same non-paying tenants in the local workhouse.
Exactly. And many of these landlords were already heavily mortgaged and in debt themselves. They looked at this law and they panicked. If they kept the starving tenants on their land, they would be bankrupted by the poor rates.
So what is their way out?
The loophole was eviction.
Ah.
If a landlord hired the Crowbar Brigade, destroyed the tenant's house, and physically drove them across the district line so they were no longer living on the landlord's estate, that starving family was no longer the landlord's financial responsibility.
So the poor laws created a massive, immediate financial incentive to evict completely destitute people.
Exactly.
And there was an extra twist of the knife here, right? A Gregory Clause.
The Gregory Clause, often called the quarter-acre clause. It stated that anyone who owned more than a quarter acre of land was legally ineligible to receive any food or relief from the workhouse.
So if I'm a starving father and I have a tiny half-acre farm that has been in my family for generations, I cannot get a bowl of soup for my dying children unless I legally sign over my land to the landlord.
You had to surrender your ancestral right to the land just to survive the week. This is why Marx called it a quiet, business-like extinction.
It makes complete sense now.
Yeah, there didn't need to be some grand, mustache-twirling conspiracy of malice. It was just the cold, calculated logic of the ledger.
Yeah.
The system was designed to literally weed out the smaller occupiers, depopulate the countryside, and transform Ireland into a massive, empty grazing pasture for English capital.
So you have a biological disaster compounded by an economic shift to cattle, weaponized by a tax loophole, resulting in crowbar brigades tearing the roofs off homes. You have 1 million people dead from starvation and disease. But what about the survivors?
They flee.
Right. They pour into the coffin ships to America, or they cross the Irish Sea. And this mass exodus sets the stage for a socio-economic collision in the very heart of the British Empire.
We are talking about an unprecedented demographic spillover. Over 1 million traumatized, dispossessed people fleeing starvation, pouring into the booming industrial cities of England, places like London, Manchester, Liverpool, and Glasgow.
And they didn't arrive with savings or job offers or any kind of social support.
They arrived with the clothes on their backs. They were the poorest of the poor. The sources describe armies of Irish immigrants forming the absolute lowest stratum of the population in these cities. In a very short window, you had 120,000 in London, 40,000 in Manchester, 34,000 in Liverpool.
Friedrich Engels wrote extensively about this. His 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, is heavily featured in our sources, and his descriptions of the living conditions, the creation of the Irish Quarter in these cities, are incredibly grim.
Yeah, Engels was wandering through places like Little Ireland in Manchester, which was located in the deep bend of the Medlock River, surrounded by Paul factory buildings that blocked out the sun and trapped all the smoke.
Sounds like a nightmare.
He describes the Irish immigrants being thrown like refuse into garrets, mud hovels, and damp, unpaved cellars. They accepted the most ruinous, filthy dwellings imaginable simply because it was all they could afford.
There's a specific sociological detail Engels focuses on that really highlights the profound cultural shock of this migration. He talks about the rural Irish practice of keeping a pig.
Yes. In rural Ireland, the pig was an absolute economic necessity. It was the family's savings account. You fed it scraps all year, and then you sold it to pay the rent. Engels noted that the Irishman loved his pig as the Arab loves his horse. It ate with the family, the children played with it, it slept in the cabin.
Which, in a rural setting with open air and fields is one thing, but bringing that agrarian survival mechanism into a hyper-dense, industrialized urban slum is a recipe for a public health catastrophe.
Exactly. When they were forced into Manchester, they brought the pig with them. They would build a pigsty against the house wall, or if the landlord forbade it, they would simply let the pig live and sleep in the tiny cellar room with the family of 6 or 7 people.
Unbelievable.
Engels calls it a new and a natural method of cattle raising in cities, entirely of Irish origin. It completely overwhelmed the non-existent sanitation systems of these slums, compounding the filth and the spread of diseases like cholera and typhus.
Listening to this, it feels like a pressure cooker. You take a traumatized agrarian people, you strip them of their land, their communal clan structures, their entire way of life. You compress them into the darkest, most disease-ridden cellars of an alien mechanized factory city.
Yeah.
But here's my question. Did the English factory owners view this influx as a crisis? Because it sounds like a humanitarian disaster that would strain the city to the breaking point.
Well, the local government might have seen it as a crisis of sanitation, but the capitalists, the factory owners, saw it as an absolute gift. It was the greatest economic windfall they could have asked for.
Why? Just because it's more bodies for the machines?
Because it provided them with a massive, desperate, reserve army of labor. The Irish worker, having barely survived the famine, had discovered the absolute minimum necessities of life. They were accustomed to surviving on a diet of terrible potatoes and wearing rags.
So their baseline for survival was drastically lower than the English workers' baseline.
Precisely. And in a ruthlessly unregulated capitalist system, wages inevitably sink to the minimum cost required to keep the worker alive and reproducing.
Right.
If an English worker stood up and demanded a wage that allowed for a decent standard of living, maybe some meat once a week, a home above ground, a few pennies for their children to attend school, the factory owner could just laugh in their face.
Because the owner could just fire the Englishman, walk down to the cellar, and hire an Irish immigrant who would happily do the same backbreaking 14-hour shift for half the pay, just to avoid starving to death.
Exactly. The Irish immigrant was unwittingly used as a wedge by the bourgeoisie to artificially depress the entire labor market. Engels argued explicitly that the rapid, highly profitable expansion of English industry could not have taken place without this impoverished Irish labor force acting as a downward drag on wages. The Irish presence forced the English workers into a desperate, cutthroat competition for survival on the lowest possible plane.
Okay, so picture the psychological state of the English working class in, say, 1850. They are already suffering, they're working dangerous jobs, their life expectancy is plummeting, they're living in poverty. Suddenly, thousands of Irish immigrants arrive. They speak differently, they bring a different religion, their cellars are filled with pigs, and most importantly, they are literally driving down the wages that the English worker needs to feed his family.
Right.
This forced proximity and intense economic competition creates an incredibly volatile powder keg. Someone is going to get angry, but who do they get angry at? Who is holding the match?
And this brings us to the absolute core of our deep dive, what Marx identified as the secret basis of power, the manufactured antagonism.
Because the tragedy here is that the English workers didn't look up at the factory owners or the landlords who caused the evictions and say, hey, this system is exploiting both of us. They looked down into the cellars, they looked at the Irish workers.
They looked at the Irish and saw an alien competitor. They saw someone bringing filth and lower standards of living into their neighborhoods. But more than that, a deep, visceral, almost racial hatred developed between the English and Irish proletarians.
Marx writes about this in a very famous, very blunt letter from April 1870, sent to two of his colleagues in New York, Siegfried Meyer and August Vogt. He makes a comparison in this letter that really forces you to stop and think.
It is a striking comparison. Marx explains that the ordinary English worker hated the Irish worker because he saw him as a competitor who lowered his standard of life.
Right.
But then Marx says the English worker viewed the Irish in the exact same way that the poor whites of the southern states of North America viewed black slaves.
That is heavy. Let's really dissect that analogy. The poor whites in the American South prior to the Civil War did not own the massive cotton plantations. They were often incredibly impoverished themselves.
Very much so.
They were economically marginalized by the plantation system, yet they violently clung to a racial hierarchy that made them feel superior to the enslaved black population. The plantation owners exploited them both, but the poor white worker received a psychological wage of racial supremacy.
Exactly.
Marx is arguing that this exact same psychological dynamic was operating in the factories of Manchester and London.
Yes. The English worker felt himself to be a member of the ruling nation. He felt national and religious antipathies toward the Irish. As long as he could look down on the Irish Catholic immigrant, he didn't feel like he was at the absolute bottom of the social ladder.
It was a psychological compensation for his own miserable economic reality.
Exactly. And by clinging to that feeling of superiority, by aligning himself in his own mind with his own English oppressors against the Irish, the English worker was actually forging his own chains.
Now, I have to push back here because it sounds like Marx is just saying that English workers were incredibly gullible. Did they have any awareness they were being played? Or did this national pride completely blind them to the fact that the factory owner was the one actually setting the wages?
For the most part, they were completely blinded. But crucially, Marx insists that this antagonism was not entirely organic. It didn't just bubble up naturally from the factory floor.
So where did it come from?
It was artificially nourished, deeply entrenched, and deliberately kept alive by the ruling classes.
How? I mean, in the 1850s and 60s, before television, before algorithms, how do you manufacture and sustain that kind of hatred on a societal level?
You use every avenue of culture and communication available. The sources explicitly state that this antagonism was stoked by the press, the pulpit, and the comic papers.
Let's break those down. The pulpit. So the sermons they heard on Sunday.
Yes. You had fiery Protestant preachers in places like Liverpool men like the Reverend Hugh McNeill delivering sermons warning of the existential threat of Catholic infiltration.
Oh.
They framed the Irish immigrants not as fellow suffering humans, but as agents of the Pope sent to undermine English liberty and Protestant values.
And the press.
The daily newspapers would constantly run sensationalist, highly exaggerated stories about Irish crime, Irish drunkenness, and Irish squalor, constantly reinforcing the narrative that the Irishman was inherently lawless and dangerous.
And then there are the comic papers, which the sources mentioned specifically, things like Punch magazine.
Punch was incredibly influential in shaping middle and working class public opinion. They would publish these vicious, full-page caricatures depicting the Irish, but they didn't draw them as normal humans.
How do they draw them?
They drew them with deliberately simian, ape-like features. They popularized the trope of the Irish Frankenstein, a violent, subhuman monster entirely lacking in reason or civilization.
So you have a media and cultural echo chamber that is operating 24/7. When the English worker goes to church, he hears the Irish are a spiritual threat. When he reads the news, he reads they're a criminal threat. When he looks at a cartoon, he sees them depicted as literal monsters.
And this, Marx argues, is the ultimate magic trick. This is the blueprint of colonial and capitalist power. He wrote in that same 1870 letter, "This scission, this division, is the true secret of maintaining its power."
It is brilliantly evil. If I am a wealthy factory owner, I don't have to spend a dime hiring strikebreakers or guards to keep my workers in line. I just have to finance the newspapers that convince half my workers that the other half is trying to destroy their way of life.
Yeah.
The workers will police each other. They will never unionize together. They will never strike together because they despise each other more than they despise me.
Exactly. And the ruling class knew that if the English and Irish working classes ever united, they could overthrow the entire system of landlordism and factory exploitation. So they invested heavily culturally and politically in keeping them permanently divided.
And the sources point out that this wasn't just a domestic strategy, it was geopolitical. This manufactured hatred crossed the Atlantic.
Yes. The million Irish who survived the coffin ships and arrived in the United States reassembled in places like New York and Boston, filled with a burning, justified hatred for the English government that had starved them.
Naturally.
And Marx notes that the governments of both England and the United States would play on these international tensions to perpetuate covert struggles, ensuring that the working classes on both sides of the Atlantic remain suspicious of each other.
So if this manufactured hatred, this psychological wage of being the ruling nation, is the lock keeping the working class in chains globally, how do you pick the lock?
That's the big question.
If you are Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, trying to orchestrate an international labor movement, how do you overcome this deeply entrenched, artificially nourished antagonism? This brings us to our final act, the strategic pivot.
And it was a massive, highly controversial pivot within their own ranks.
Okay, tell me about it.
If you look at Marx's writings in the 1840s, around the time of the Communist Manifesto, his initial belief was very traditional. He thought the English working class, because they were in the most advanced, highly industrialized capitalist country in the world, would inevitably rise up, launch a social revolution, and, as a byproduct of overthrowing the English capitalists, they would subsequently free Ireland from colonial rule.
Right, the vanguard of the revolution has to be the industrial proletariat in the center of the empire. That's economics 101 for them.
It was. But by the late 1860s, after decades of obsessively studying the history of the Irish confiscations, the mechanics of the famine, and the deep psychological division in the English factories, he changed his mind completely. He realized he had it backwards.
What was the revelation?
He realized that the English working class could never achieve its own emancipation until Ireland was free. Irish independence was no longer a secondary humanitarian goal to be dealt with after the revolution. It was the absolute, fundamental prerequisite for English freedom.
Okay, wait. I need you to explain the structural logic here. If the English workers are the ones actually working in the industrial center of global capital, why do they need a rural agricultural colony across the sea to be freed first?
Because of where the power and the wealth of the ruling class actually originated, Marx identified Ireland as the bulwark, the foundational stronghold of English landlordism.
The bulwark, the structural cornerstone.
Yes, the English landed aristocracy, the lords, the earls, the politicians in Parliament, drew a massive portion of their immense wealth from their estates in Ireland.
I see.
They were absentee landlords, collecting exorbitant rents from Irish peasants and spending that wealth in London to maintain their political dominance. Furthermore, Ireland was the training ground for their military and the source of cheap agricultural products.
Listening to this, it feels like trying to demolish a heavily fortified, deeply corrupt castle.
Yeah.
For decades, the English workers have been trying to bash their heads against the heavily armored iron gates of this castle located in London, demanding higher wages and political rights. And they are getting nowhere because the gates are too strong and they keep fighting with the Irish workers standing next to them.
Right.
But Marx realizes the structural cornerstone of that castle isn't in London at all. It's located in Dublin.
That analogy is perfect. The exploitation of Ireland wasn't just a source of material wealth. It was the ruling class's greatest moral power. It represented the unassailable domination of England over a subject nation. If you maintain the power of the landlords in Ireland, you make them financially and politically invulnerable in England itself.
So you stop attacking the front gates in London, you sneak around, you cross the Irish Sea, and you pull out that foundational cornerstone in Dublin. If you can break the power of the English landlords in Ireland, their wealth dries up, their political power wanes, and the whole structure in London collapses.
Exactly. If English landlordism fell in Ireland, it would inevitably fall in England. And Marx argued it would be 100 times easier to strike that blow in Ireland for three very specific reasons.
Let's hear them.
First, the economic struggle in Ireland was concentrated exclusively on landed property. It was clear, visible, and binary. Landlords versus peasants.
Very straightforward.
Second, it was simultaneously a national struggle for survival against a foreign occupier, giving it massive emotional weight.
Okay.
And third, the Irish people, having been starved and evicted, were far more revolutionary, desperate, and exasperated than the English workers, who were somewhat pacified by being part of the ruling nation.
And this analysis brings us to a specific historical group that pops up frequently in Marx and Engels' correspondence from the 1860s, which is the Fenians, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Who were they and how did they fit into this new strategy?
The Fenian movement arose in the late 1850s, largely founded by Irish immigrants in America like John O'Mahony, and spreading back to Ireland under leaders like James Stephens. They were a secret, oath-bound society dedicated to establishing an independent Irish republic, entirely separated from the British Empire, through armed uprising.
Now, based on everything I know about Marx and Engels, they despised secret societies. And they certainly weren't fans of random terrorism.
No, they were highly critical of the Fenians' tactics. In 1867, a group of Fenians blew up the wall of Clerkenwell Prison in London, trying to rescue a prisoner, and the explosion killed several innocent working-class people living nearby.
Oh, man.
Marx was furious. He wrote that these conspiratorial, terroristic tactics were completely counterproductive because they alienated the very English working-class allies the Irish desperately needed.
But despite despising the bombings, Marx and Engels threw their political weight behind the Fenians' cause. They campaigned for amnesty for Fenian prisoners. Why support a group whose tactics you hate?
Because they recognized the Fenians as a fundamentally new type of movement. Previous Irish political movements, like Daniel O'Connell's in the 1840s, were led by the urban bourgeois, or the remnants of the Catholic aristocracy, people who just wanted a slightly better deal for themselves within the framework of the British Empire.
They just wanted a seat at the table.
Right. But the Fenians were different. They were a genuine, lower-order grassroots movement expressing the sheer rage of the displaced peasantry and the urban poor. They weren't asking for a seat at the landlord's table. They wanted to flip the table over and take the land back.
Wow.
Marx noted that Fenianism was characterized by socialist leanings, even if they didn't use that vocabulary, because its core mission was directed against the fundamental appropriation of the soil.
So if the goal is to pull that cornerstone out of Dublin, and the Fenians are the ones pulling on it, what was the mission for the International Working Men's Association? What did Marx tell the English workers they needed to do?
He told them they had to undergo a massive psychological paradigm shift. In 1870, Marx drafted a secret circular on behalf of the General Council of the International, sending it out to the workers. His message was blunt. The mission of the International was to force the English workers to take the initiative in dissolving the 1801 Act of Union between Britain and Ireland.
They had to actively champion the independence of the very people they had been taught to hate.
Yes, and crucially, Marx told them they must not do this out of some vague humanitarian sympathy for the Irish. This wasn't about charity. They had to fight for Irish independence as an absolute, selfish, logistical necessity for their own survival.
They had to realize that freeing Ireland was the only way to free themselves. They had to see through the propaganda of the press, the pulpit, and the comic papers.
He told the English workers that their primary condition for emancipation, the overthrow of the English landed oligarchy, would remain utterly unattainable as long as they made common cause with their own oppressors against Ireland.
There is a quote in the sources that really anchors this entire geopolitical philosophy. Marx says, "Any people that oppresses another people forges its own chains." That's a reference to the Roman Republic, isn't it?
It is. The historical lesson is that when a republic turns into an empire and begins violently oppressing other nations, it inevitably requires a massive standing military, a deeply corrupt political system, and a psychologically divided, heavily policed populace to maintain that empire.
Right.
And those very tools of oppression, once perfected on the colony, eventually turn inward and enslave the citizens of the republic itself.
By subjugating Ireland, the English working class guaranteed their own subjugation to the capitalists. The chains they placed on the Irish worker were the exact same chains binding them to the factory floor.
It was a massive strategic pivot. Marx transformed the fight for Irish national independence from a localized ethnic or religious conflict into the absolute linchpin of the broader international labor movement. Striking a blow in Ireland was the only way to pull the rug out from under the British Empire and break the psychological spell holding the workers apart.
Let's take a deep breath and just recap the sheer scale of the historical and economic architecture we've just explored. We started in the rolling green hills of a pre-capitalist Ireland, looking at the communal rundale system, where clans shared land for survival rather than individual profit. We watched as a 700-year forced, completely incompatible legal software update crashed that system, replacing it with the rigid, profit-driven laws of English landlordism.
We saw the brutal mathematical logic of the 19th century agricultural revolution, where the repeal of the corn laws made sheep and cattle more profitable than human beings. This led to the horror of the Crowbar brigades and the weaponization of the poor laws during the famine, culminating in the quiet businesslike extinction of the Irish tenant farmer.
We followed that desperate, starving spillover of humanity as they fled across the sea and into the damp, lightless cellars of Manchester and London, where they were used as an unwitting tool, a reserve army of labor, to drive down the wages of the English working class to the absolute threshold of survival.
And we unpacked the ultimate sleight of hand, how the ruling class deployed the press, the pulpit, and the comic papers to manufacture a deep, visceral, racial hatred between the English and Irish workers. They paid the English worker a psychological wage of supremacy, a distraction so powerful it kept the working class fighting each other for crumbs in the cellar, while the landlords and factory owners kept the entire bakery.
And finally, we saw Marx's realization that the front gates of power in London were too heavily guarded by this manufactured division. The only way to break the power of the London capitalists was to pull out their foundational Cornerstone in Dublin. The English worker could never be free as long as he was helping to hold the leash on the Irish worker.
It is an unparalleled masterclass in seeing through the manufactured narratives of power and understanding the hidden structures that dictate our economic reality.
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters to you, listening right now. We aren't living in 19th century Manchester. You probably aren't keeping a pig in your cellar, and you likely aren't reading Punch magazine. But the mechanics of power, the blueprints of that magic trick, they haven't fundamentally changed. The ruling classes still benefit immensely when ordinary working people fight fiercely amongst themselves.
The tools of division are just vastly more sophisticated now. It's no longer just a weekly comic paper or a Sunday sermon. It's highly targeted algorithms, curated social media echo chambers, and 24-hour news cycles perfectly optimized to generate visceral outrage at your neighbor.
Exactly. Marx and Engels saw that the press and the politicians of the 19th century actively stoked cultural, religious, and national hatred to protect their own consolidated wealth. They weaponized nationalism to blind people to their shared economic reality. So, Here's a final lingering thought for you to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
Yeah, think about this.
When you look at the media landscape and the political rhetoric of our world today, when you feel that sudden engineered surge of anger at a specific demographic or a rival group, what subtle, artificially manufactured antagonisms might be shaping your economic reality? Who mathematically benefits when you are kept angry at the person living next door instead of looking up and questioning the architecture of the system itself? Are you looking closely at the mechanics of the magic trick, or are you just falling for the misdirection?